Dr. Jason Carter had become something of a legend on the Andariel Medical Station. As the sole human on a facility orbiting deep in the edges of the Milky Way, he was a curiosity, a living example of Earth's strides toward galactic integration. But Jason had come for the medicine, not the attention. The opportunity to work with species from across the galaxy had been too great to resist. Alien biology fascinated him. The complexities of different species' anatomy and medicine stretched his skills and imagination to their limits. His closest companion in this strange interstellar life was Lyra, an Andariel nurse who had been assigned to assist him ever since he arrived. The Andariels were known for their calm, almost stoic nature. Lyra, with her silvery skin that shimmered in the ambient light, her translucent, flowing hair and delicate antennae, was no exception. She was efficient, focused, and professional to the core. Her piercing violet eyes, though alien, always conveyed a sense of serene composure. Jason appreciated her presence. Her calm nature helped balance his more erratic human tendencies. Even during the most high-stakes surgeries, Lyra remained a pillar of quiet strength. Together, they made an excellent team. But something was different today. Jason first noticed it during their midday rounds. They had just finished checking on a Korgan patient, recovering from an arm regeneration procedure. Lyra seemed distracted, her usual precision faltering. She lingered over tasks she usually completed in seconds, her eyes darting toward Jason more frequently than usual. Her skin, usually a serene silver, had taken on a faint pinkish hue that Jason couldn't recall seeing before. "Lyra, are you all right?" Jason asked, his voice laced with concern. It wasn't like her to be so off. Lyra blinked rapidly, her antennae twitching as though struggling to focus. "I'm fine, Dr. Carter," she said, but there was an edge to her voice, a breathless quality that raised alarms in Jason's mind. They continued their rounds, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the time they reached the med bay to check on their last patient, Lyra's behavior had grown more erratic. Her movements were jerky, and she seemed to be struggling to breathe evenly. Her skin had turned a deep shade of pink now, almost glowing under the station's fluorescent lights. Jason's concern deepened. He gently reached out to touch her arm, an instinctual human gesture of care. "Lyra, seriously, what's going on? You don't look well." The moment his hand made contact with her skin, Lyra flinched as if she'd been burned. Her violet eyes widened in shock, and her antennae straightened, trembling with what Jason could only describe as panic. I need to leave," she stammered, her voice high-pitched, almost desperate. Without waiting for a response, Lyra turned and bolted from the room, leaving Jason standing in stunned silence. Hours passed, and Jason couldn't shake the image of Lyra's panicked expression from his mind. He had tried contacting her, but his calls to her quarters went unanswered. Growing more concerned, he did what any doctor would do in his position. He sought answers. Accessing the Andariel medical database, he began searching for any possible explanation for her symptoms. He combed through entries on Andariel physiology, looking for anything that might explain the pink hue of her skin or her sudden erratic behavior. After what felt like an eternity, he found something that chilled him to his core. It was buried deep within the Andariel biological records, under a section labeled Reproductive Cycles. The Andariels were an extremely private species when it came to matters of mating and reproduction. Jason hadn't thought much of it before. It wasn't exactly relevant to his medical work. But now, as he read through the data, a horrifying realization dawned on him. Every few years, female Andariels entered what was called Virnath, a sudden and intense reproductive phase that overtook their entire physiology. It was an evolutionary response triggered by proximity to a potential mate, their bodies overwhelmed by a flood of hormones that drove them into a frenzy until the reproductive process was complete. During this phase, the Andariel's skin would flush with color, their body temperatures would spike, and they would experience overwhelming physical and emotional distress until they could mate. And it was a process that could be triggered by prolonged exposure to any species, even humans. Jason leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. This can't be happening, he thought. He and Lyra had worked side by side for years. They had shared close quarters, intense surgeries, and countless hours of conversation. But they had never crossed any lines. He respected her, admired her, but had never imagined anything more. And now this, he reread the entry, his mind racing. The Virnath could be dangerous if not properly managed. It was a primal biological urge that could consume the Andariel completely, driving them to extremes in their desperation to mate. If Lyra was experiencing this and hadn't found a way to control it. Jason stood up abruptly. He had to find her. He couldn't leave her like this. Not when she might be suffering through something so intense, something she couldn't control. He grabbed his medical kit and hurried out of the med bay, heading toward the residential quarters where Lyra lived. His mind raced with possible solutions. Maybe there was something he could do to help regulate her hormones, a medical intervention that could ease her symptoms. He had to believe there was a way to help her without crossing the line. The corridors of the station were quiet as Jason made his way to Lyra's quarters. His heart pounded in his ears, a mix of fear and determination driving him forward. When he reached her door, he hesitated for only a moment before pressing the chime. There was no answer. "Lyra," he called, knocking on the door. "It's Jason. Are you in there?" Still nothing. Jason's hand hovered over the door's manual override. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but he also couldn't leave her in this state. Steeling himself, he entered the override code, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. What he found inside sent a shockwave of disbelief through him. Lyra was there, curled up on the floor, her body trembling. Her skin was flushed a deep, almost glowing pink, her antennae twitching wildly. But it was her eyes that struck him the most wide, desperate, and locked onto him the moment he stepped inside. "Jason," she whispered, her voice raw with need. "I can't control it." Chapter 2. A desperate struggle. Jason froze for a moment, standing at the threshold of Lyra's quarters. His mind raced, trying to process the scene before him. He had expected something serious, but not this. Not the sight of Lyra, usually so composed and calm, reduced to trembling desperation. Lyra's skin was now fully saturated in a glowing pink, her silvery hair tangled and damp as though she had been sweating profusely. The atmosphere in the room felt thick, charged with something primal, a force that seemed to claw at the edges of Jason's consciousness. Her violet eyes, usually calm and distant, were locked on him with a focus that sent a shiver down his spine. I don't know what to do," Jason stammered. He had seen the entry in the Andariel medical database, but reading about something and seeing it were entirely different. There were no clear instructions on how to help someone in the throes of Virnath, especially not a nurse you had worked alongside for years. Lyra's breathing was labored, each breath shaky as she tried to steady herself. She seemed to be caught between two forces, her rational mind still clinging to her sense of control, and the biological urges that were rapidly overtaking her. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low, almost feral. "It's not safe." Jason took a cautious step forward. "Lyra, I know what's happening to you. It's the Virnath, right? You're in a mating cycle." Her eyes flickered with shame, and she turned her head away, her antennae drooping. "Yes, but I didn't want you to know. I thought I could control it." Jason knelt down, keeping his distance, but trying to make her feel less alone. "You don't have to control it alone. I'm a doctor. I'm here to help you. There must be something we can do." Lyra's head snapped back toward him, her eyes blazing with a mix of frustration and desperation. "There is nothing. The Andariel mating cycle is unstoppable once triggered. Our bodies, they take over. It's not just a simple urge, Jason. It's biological, primal. We have to mate or what?" Jason asked softly, though he already had an idea of the answer. Lyra's gaze faltered, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Or we die." The weight of her words crashed over him like a tidal wave. The Virnath wasn't just some inconvenient biological phase. It was a life-or-death situation, one that would consume her entirely if left unchecked. Jason's pulse quickened, and the gravity of the situation settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had to act, but how? The Andariel database had been vague on treatments, but there were hints about hormonal suppression methods that could slow the process. However, they were risky and often unreliable. Most of the solutions required medical intervention far beyond what he had access to on the station. He racked his brain for any possibilities, pacing the room as Lyra watched him with a mixture of hope and dread. "Let me think," he muttered under his breath. There had to be something that could ease the symptoms, calm her system long enough for them to figure out a solution. But his thoughts kept coming back to one painful reality. The only surefire way to end the cycle was to fulfill it. "I'm sorry," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't want this to happen, not to you." Jason stopped pacing and looked at her. Despite her desperate condition, her concern was for him. She was trying to protect him from her own biology, from the inevitable truth of what her body required. He couldn't help but feel a surge of compassion for her. This was not her fault. This wasn't something either of them could have predicted or prevented. He crouched down, meeting her eye level. "Lyra, I'm not going to let you die. We'll figure this out, okay? There's got to be a way." She shook her head, biting her lip as if struggling against the pull of her own body. "I can't hold it off much longer. Jason, if you don't leave now, I won't be able to stop myself." Jason's chest tightened. He had no desire to abandon her in her time of need, but the intensity of her situation was becoming clearer with every second. He could see the strain on her face, the twitching in her muscles, as if she were fighting against invisible chains. Her body was ready to take over completely. "I'm not going anywhere," Jason said firmly, "but we have to get you stabilized. Maybe if we can lower your body temperature or find some kind of suppressant, we can delay the cycle. Let me get my medical kit. There has to be something." But before he could finish, Lyra's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers trembling as she held him in place. Her breathing grew heavier, her pupils dilating as she gazed at him with a mixture of fear, desire, and something else, something primal and uncontrollable. "You don't understand," she panted, her voice growing more ragged by the second. "It's too late for that. The moment you touched me, it began. The cycle is already in motion." Jason swallowed hard, realizing with horror that his earlier touch, that simple, innocent gesture of concern, might have been the catalyst for all of this. His mind raced as he searched for a solution, but Lyra's grip on him tightened, her body trembling violently as she fought against the inevitable. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I don't want this to happen like this. But my body, it won't stop." Jason's heart hammered in his chest. He knew what she was saying, what she was implying. The Virnath wasn't something she could resist, no matter how much she wanted to. It was a biological imperative, an unstoppable force that had already taken hold of her. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I won't let you suffer, but we need to find a way to manage this without—" "I can't?" she gasped, her whole body shaking now as she clung to him. "I can't hold it back anymore. I'm losing control." Jason felt a surge of panic rising in his chest. He had to do something, anything, to help her. But what could he do? Every medical option he had considered seemed impossible in the face of the intensity of the Virnath. And now, with her body fully overtaken by the mating cycle, time was running out. As Lyra's trembling grew more violent, Jason realized he was out of options. He could either leave her to die a slow, agonizing death as her body succumbed to the cycle's unfulfilled demands. Or no, he couldn't think about that. There had to be another way. But before he could react, Lyra's grip on his wrist suddenly released, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as her body convulsed. Jason rushed to her side, his medical instincts taking over. He had to find a way to save her, no matter what it took. Chapter 3. The point of no return. Lyra lay on the floor, her body trembling as if caught in an internal war. Jason knelt beside her, panic seizing his mind as he watched the once strong nurse collapse into a heap of uncontrollable spasms. Her skin had turned a deeper shade of pink, almost bordering on red now, radiating heat that Jason could feel just being near her. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her violet eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Jason's mind was a whirlwind of medical knowledge and instinct, but nothing he had learned in his time as a doctor, human or otherwise, could have prepared him for this. His first thought was to cool her down, try to bring her temperature back to a more manageable level. But the Andariel physiology was delicate, and anything too extreme could cause more harm than good. "Lyra," Jason whispered, his voice laced with urgency, "I'm going to try something to lower your body temperature. I don't know if it'll help, but it's better than doing nothing." Her head lolled weakly to the side, and for a moment Jason wasn't sure she had heard him. But then her eyes met his, and in them he saw a fleeting glimpse of clarity, an acknowledgment of his words. "Hurry," she managed to rasp, her voice barely audible over the sound of her ragged breathing. Jason rushed to his medical kit, hands trembling as he rifled through the contents. He found a small vial of coolant serum designed to lower body temperature in cases of extreme heat stroke, primarily for species with high metabolic rates. It wasn't meant for Andariels, but right now it was the only thing he had. He filled a syringe and knelt beside Lyra again, gently taking her arm. "This might sting a little, but it'll help bring your temperature down," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Inside, he was anything but calm. The needle pierced her skin, and he injected the serum. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Lyra's convulsions began to subside, her breathing evening out just slightly. Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, watching as the color in her skin seemed to fade from that deep, alarming red back to a softer pink. But it wasn't enough. The Varnath was still coursing through her system, and while the serum had bought them some time, it hadn't stopped the underlying problem. Lyra was still burning up with need, still struggling against the primal forces trying to take over her body. She clenched her fists, her body twitching involuntarily as she fought to stay conscious. Jason felt helpless. He had treated countless patients, had saved lives in impossible situations, but this was different. This was Lyra. This wasn't just a clinical case. This was someone he cared about, someone who had stood by his side through thick and thin. And now she was suffering in a way he couldn't fix with mere medicine. "Jason." Lyra's voice, though weak, cut through his frantic thoughts. Her eyes were open again, more focused now, but they were filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability he had never seen before. "You can't save me this way." He swallowed hard, not wanting to accept what she was saying. "There has to be something. There has to be a way to control it without... There isn't," she interrupted, her voice tinged with both resignation and desperation. "The Varnath can't be stopped once it starts. The cycle needs to be fulfilled or it'll kill me. It's not something we can medicate away. I can feel it. It's getting stronger. I won't survive the night like this." Jason's mind rebelled against her words. He had always prided himself on finding solutions, on pushing past the boundaries of what seemed possible. But now, standing on the precipice of an impossible choice, he realized that there were limits even to his knowledge. Lyra's hand reached out, trembling, and rested lightly on his arm. The touch was both gentle and urgent, as if she was trying to convey something that words couldn't fully express. "I didn't want this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want it to happen like this. But if you stay, I won't be able to stop myself." Her eyes bore into his, pleading with him to understand. Jason could feel the weight of her emotions, the pain of her internal struggle. She was trapped, caught in the grip of a biological force beyond her control. And here he was, her only hope of survival, but also the very trigger of her torment. "I can't just leave you," Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't." "You have to," she said, though the way her hand tightened slightly around his arm suggested that she didn't truly want him to go. "If you don't, I won't be able to hold back anymore." And then, her words trailed off, but Jason knew what she meant. He knew exactly what she was saying, and the implications of it made his heart race. Could he really abandon her now? Could he leave her to die, knowing there was a way to save her? But the alternative was something neither of them had ever considered. It wasn't just the ethical dilemma, it was the emotional one. What would this mean for them? For their friendship? For everything they had built together over the years? "I'm not leaving you," Jason said finally, his voice firm. He had made up his mind. He couldn't let her die, not like this, not when there was a chance, however complicated, that he could save her. "We'll get through this together." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Jason, are you sure?" He nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. I'm sure. We'll figure it out. We always do. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of the situation settling between them. The air felt thick, charged with an intensity that neither of them had ever experienced before. Jason's mind was still racing, but now there was a new layer of awareness, an unspoken understanding of what had to be done. Lyra closed her eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath, as if trying to center herself one last time before the Vernath took full control. Then, don't hold back, she whispered. Jason's throat tightened as he realized there was no going back. They were crossing a line neither of them had ever intended to cross. But there was no more time for second guessing. This was about survival now, hers, and in a way his too. He knelt beside her again, and as their eyes met for what felt like an eternity, Jason made a promise to himself. Whatever happened after this, however complicated or confusing things might become, he would make sure Lyra survived. That was all that mattered now. Slowly, tentatively, he reached for her, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over her heated skin. He could feel the pull of her body, the biological force that had been driving her to the edge, and as he touched her, gently at first, he could sense the change in her immediately. Lyra's body responded almost instantly, a soft gasp escaping her lips as her skin flushed even deeper, her antennae twitching wildly. Her breathing quickened again, but this time it wasn't out of pain or desperation. It was something else, something primal. Jason's own heart was racing, his mind barely able to keep up with what was happening. But there was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and so had she. Chapter 4. The Bonds Forged in Fire. The medbay was quiet, save for the sound of Jason's rapid heartbeat and the faint hum of the Andariel station systems. Lyra lay beside him, her body still trembling slightly, but her breathing had evened out. The room felt like a world unto itself, detached from the station, as if the universe had paused just for them. Jason pulled back slowly, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and confusion. He had done it. He had saved her. But the weight of what had just happened, of what he had just done, was starting to settle over him like a thick fog. It was as if a line had been crossed, not just physically but emotionally, and the repercussions of that were slowly unfurling in his mind. Lyra's violet eyes fluttered open. The color in her skin had returned to its natural silvery hue, the dangerous pink now gone. She seemed more at ease, the tension that had gripped her body for the past hours finally dissipating. For a moment, the silence between them was so profound that it felt as though the air itself had grown heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," Lyra whispered, her voice fragile but steady. "You shouldn't have had to do that." Jason shook his head, not trusting his voice to stay steady. "You don't have to apologize. I made the decision. I couldn't let you. I couldn't just watch you suffer." She looked away, her antennae twitching with something close to shame. "You don't understand. This changes everything." Her tone was laced with regret, a sadness that Jason hadn't expected. It cut him deeper than he thought possible. "What do you mean?" Jason asked, his brow furrowing as he tried to grasp what she was implying. "The Vernath isn't just a biological cycle, Jason," she explained, her voice soft and hesitant. "It's not just about mating, it's a bonding process. When an Andariel enters the Vernath, their body forms a connection with their mate, a connection that's deeper than anything most species experience. It's permanent." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Permanent?" Lyra nodded, her eyes still avoiding his. "Yes, my body, my mind, they're connected to you now. Forever." The word hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Jason sat back, trying to process what she had just said. Permanent. A bond that couldn't be broken. His mind raced through the implications, through the ways this could change everything about their relationship, everything about their lives. "I didn't know." Jason's voice trailed off. "Lyra, if I had known, you would have left," she finished for him, finally turning to meet his gaze. "And I would have died. That's the choice you made." Jason swallowed hard. He could see the truth in her words. He had made that choice, and now they were both bound by it. But even as his mind grappled with the consequences, a part of him couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief, as if some deeper part of him had always known that there was something more between them, something waiting beneath the surface. just waiting for the right moment to emerge. Lyra seemed to sense his internal conflict, her eyes softening. "You didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "Neither did I. But we have to deal with it now. The bond isn't something you can just walk away from. It's a part of us." Jason let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. He felt overwhelmed, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether to jump or retreat. But there was no retreating now. He had crossed that line, and there was no going back. "What does this bond mean, exactly?" he asked, trying to regain some sense of control over the situation. "For us, I mean." Lyra sat up slowly, her body still weak from the ordeal, but her mind sharper now. "It means we'll always be connected, on a level that most species can't understand. You'll sense my emotions, and I'll sense yours. It's not mind reading, exactly, but it's close." Jason blinked, his mind reeling from the revelation. "So, you'll always know how I'm feeling." Lyra nodded, her antennae twitching slightly. "Yes, and you'll know how I'm feeling. It's intimate, in ways that words can't really explain." Jason let the words sink in. He would always be connected to her, always aware of her emotions, her thoughts, her feelings. It was overwhelming, but at the same time he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in it. After everything they had been through together, this bond, as strange and alien as it was, didn't feel entirely wrong. "I don't regret saving you," Jason said quietly, his voice firm. "I don't regret what we did. I made the choice because I care about you, Lyra. Maybe this bond is a lot to take in, but it's not something I'm afraid of." Lyra's eyes softened, her violet gaze meeting his with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," she whispered. "I care about you too, more than I ever realized." Jason felt a weight lift from his chest at her words. Despite the complexity of the situation, despite the bond that now tied them together, there was a sense of clarity in the room. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back, but maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. The silence between them stretched for a few moments, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who had shared something profound, something that had changed them both in ways they hadn't expected. Finally, Lyra broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady. "The bond will take time to adjust to. We'll have to figure it out as we go. But we'll get through this. Together." Jason nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. They would get through it. Whatever challenges this bond brought, they would face them as they always had, side by side. "I'm with you," he said, his voice full of conviction. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Lyra smiled for the first time since the ordeal had begun, and it was like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, Jason, for everything." Jason stood, offering her a hand to help her up. As she took it, their fingers intertwined in a way that felt natural, as if the bond between them had already begun to settle into something deeper, something lasting. Together, they walked out of her quarters,